George Vance Progressive Repertoire Book 2, Full Guide. For the preparation for Sakura Cherry Blossoms, practice this D, E, F, E over and over again until you get it consistently. When moving up to this G harmonic, try doing it without moving your thumb away from the back of the neck. That way you can easily pivot back into the third position. You don't want this. For the preparation for Long, Long Ago, the challenging part of this is the distance of the pivot. Here, in third position, it's much smaller than it is back here. For Long, Long Ago, the pivots are a bit awkward. I wouldn't recommend this fingering outside of this context. However, it is helpful to practice the pivot. This is a bit of a common theme throughout the book. Sometimes Vance is asking you to do something for the sake of learning the skill, and not necessarily because it's the best fingering in that situation. There's two things to look out for in the lullaby. The first is the rhythm with the grace notes in the last bar of the preparation. You don't want to let those tiny notes disturb the overall rhythm. So the overall rhythm is... And with the grace notes, it's... All the big notes should stay in the same place. The other thing to look for is playing the G on the A string in third position. This can be a hard note to find. It's usually further up the fingerboard than you think it is. Something that you can do to practice this is to play a G major scale starting from this G and going up to the G harmonic. This next one is in half position, which is the largest of all the positions, so you need to make sure that your hand shape is nice and wide. Double check these notes with a tuner to make sure that you're actually playing them in tune. The book suggests that you play this without depressing the first finger the whole time. So I really don't like that advice. I feel like it can lead to a lot of really bad habits, and it also causes some strain in the wrist to do that. I would keep all the fingers down. However, having the first finger off will make it easier to do some vibrato on the longer notes, so maybe practice it a little both ways. of the Volga Boatman. This one is marked pesante, which means heavy. So throughout, you want a strong articulation. The left hand can tend to fall behind in the 8th to 16th rhythms, especially when they're slurred. So make sure that you're really disciplined with this. Don't let the rhythm get lazy. For the next one, it's the same thing, we just take it up an octave. The same thing applies with the lazy rhythm in bar 4 and other times that happens. But the big thing to watch out for in this one is the forked fingering. So a forked fingering is when we play 2 notes across from each other with 2 different fingers. So back in these positions, we can just bar across 2 notes. But in 4th position and higher, it gets much, much harder to do that without dislocating your shoulder. So what you have to do is push one finger down on one string and then put the next finger down above it directly. Try practicing both of them as a double stop to make sure that you have both notes down and that they're in tune. In the long ago variation, make sure you use enough bow in the slur so that you have enough bow to make a good sound on the 2 up bows. So. And also really try to articulate it as if it was 2 separate notes. Perpetual motion. Same thing as the first piece. Try to reach that G without displacing your thumb too much. So. When shifting and pivoting quickly throughout this one, it's important that we're not squeezing with our left hand. If we squeeze down here, it makes it very hard to shift and pivot quickly. You'll need this in measure 6. Make sure that you're nice and relaxed for this measure. happy bass player is a return from Book 1 with a slightly different fingering. In measure 14, be sure to match the closed D to the next open D. Those two Ds need to sound the same. Similar idea. This is the same as it was in Book 1. We just now have some closed G's and D's instead of open. And the same thing applies. When you're playing, make sure that those are the same. French song. For the preparation, same thing as I was saying before. Try to keep the thumb in place when reaching up for the first part of the preparation. Now for me personally, when I have to put the first finger on F and then reach to the G, it's actually much easier for me to bring the thumb on top of the fingerboard. So if I don't do that, it causes a lot of strain in my hand, and I tend to go flat on the G. So in measure 19, I'll do this. I'll bring the thumb up on the fingerboard behind the F when I'm playing F, G, F, and then I'll bring the thumb back when we go down to the E. So slowly it's... or at tempo. If you can do it the other way, do it, but for me, it's just really uncomfortable to do that. For this one, the left hand really has to be disciplined. A lot of the rhythm is coming from the left hand through the slurs. It can be very easy for the rhythm in the left hand to get lazy, especially when there's a shift in the middle of the slur. For example, pick up to bar 12. Might be good to practice this separate first. And then when you're ready, add the slurs back in. It can be very easy for this to get uneven and end up like... When you go into measure 15, I actually find it easier to close the G with the thumb rather than leaving it as a harmonic. I feel like it can be very weird for both hands to be constantly moving between a closed A and a harmonic G. So use the harmonic to find the G and the pick up to 15. So coming from harmonic, and now it's closed. Desiring. This one can be tricky. I actually think I went a little too fast in my recording of this. This one is just full of pivots and shifts, and you don't get a break, especially if you don't take the repeat. It just keeps going the entire time. So you need to make sure that your left hand is nice and loose throughout. And also don't forget to move the contact point of the bow when going from first position up to fourth position. It needs to move closer to the bridge. The intonation in measure 15, 16, 17, and 18 can be tricky, so I'd recommend working on that with a tuner. Instances of playing the same note with two different fingers. This happens once in measure 13, where we have a B with the fourth finger, and then we pivot back to a B with the second finger. So it's important to make sure that these two Bs match each other. This also happens again in measure 17, where we have the E with the second finger, and then E with the first finger. For the musette, make sure you practice this preparation quite a bit faster than it's shown here. So it gives you the preparation in quarter notes and half notes. then in the piece, it makes you play it in 16th notes at a pretty quick tempo. So I would recommend actually practicing this preparation in 16th notes. I think that'll prepare you for the piece better. When actually playing the piece, make sure you put some space between the quarter note and the 16th notes to give it more clarity. In measure 15, watch out for your intonation between the G sharp and the G natural. Impertinence. For the preparation of this one, it focuses on G minor instead of G major. And again, this one's pretty fast, so I think I would practice that preparation faster than it's written. In measure 19, use the G harmonic to smoothly shift between the A and the F sharp. Preparation for this one looks really difficult, but really all it is about you getting this D and this D in the same position without moving your hand. The low D is just there as a tuning anchor. So I would first practice this without the low D. Then once that's comfy, add the lower note in there. In the second half of this one, when it goes up to fourth position, personally, I prefer playing whole steps, especially whole steps on the lower strings, 1 to 3 instead of 1 to 2 in most cases. For me, it's just easier, I think, because my hands aren't very big. If you have huge hands and you can reach it no problem, then play it 1 to 2. But, for example, in measure 25, I would prefer to play that thumb, 3, 1, thumb. The one exception to that rule is in measure 26, when we have E, F sharp, G, and it's all under a slur. If we play it the way that I suggested, it would end up 1, 3, 3. So for that instance, I think it is better to play 1, 2, 3. Allegro, similar to the one a few pages back, we have a grace note. We don't want to let the grace note mess with the rhythm. So practice it first without the grace note, and then with the grace note. Also, anytime that you have the quarter note tied to the eighth and then 2/16 after, such as in measure 10, be sure you count through that quarter note. It's very easy to cut that short. So starting a couple bars before. Minuet in D. This is another example of using a difficult fingering kind of just for the sake of doing it. It makes much more sense to play the main figure in measure 5 with an open D instead of a closed one. It's easier on the bow, it's easier on the left hand, and because the next note is also on the D string, you can easily control the length of that open D. The reason he does it is to get you comfortable with the string crossings. So I would recommend practicing the way that it's written first, just so that you get comfortable with the bow, and then take it away because it is more practical to just play open D there. Measure 27 can also be pretty tricky, moving from this top E quickly down to this F sharp and then A sharp on the A and D strings. I'd recommend practicing this slowly on its own before trying to run the whole thing. one can be kind of tough intonation-wise because you have to make sure that you're matching open G with the G that you play in second position with the first finger. In the first measure, we're playing G in the second position, but then we immediately play open G. So if those two Gs are different, they're going to stick out a lot. In measure 8, it can be helpful when slurring from the high G to the low G to actually pluck the string a little bit to get that low G to sound. Because sometimes if you don't do that, the harmonic will just keep going. I find the transition in measure 23 to 24 to be pretty challenging because you're dropping across 3 strings quickly in 4th position. So you might want to isolate this spot before practicing the whole thing. This one is the same as it was earlier, but now it's an octave higher in 4th position. This is a good one to practice your vibrato on. The hardest part about this one is finding the A after you've shifted up to get the D. So what you might want to do is just practice those 2 notes back and forth. The spots to look at in this one are the sequences that first happen in measure 7 and 8. And then later in 24 and 25. Those could both be pretty challenging because of the amount of pivots in the middle of them. And then the one at measure 18 can also be pretty challenging. I would first practice this separate bow before adding the bowing in there. And then the crescendo and decrescendo if you can manage it. The Scherzo. This one is tough, I think, just because it's so long. It's probably the most challenging piece in the book. I wouldn't take the tempo too literally. 120, 16 notes is pretty fast. I would say slow it down a little bit and practice getting a good off-the-string stroke on these notes. So first find your stroke at maybe around 100 or so, and then practice it on just one note. Once you can get through it at that tempo, then turn the metronome up. The middle section is not easy either, particularly these up bow slurs. There's usually a big shift in the middle of them. But I think the hardest one is actually measure 42. We're playing up bow and we have to play A, D, F, A. I think the trick to this is to first make sure you use all your bow on the F. And then on the first 3 notes of this slur, only use about half the bow so you have enough left for that A. We also have a pretty difficult shift in measure 55 where we go from a C on the D string to a B. A nice major 7th shift there. It's easiest if you make sure that second finger is already on the string and ready to go while you're playing the C, so that way you don't feel like you have to jump for it. Another thing that you can do is put a note in between the 2 notes to help you get used to shifting it. So you could try this with C, G, B, and then a little harder is C, E, B, and then just go for it. Waltz. For this one, I would just recommend a different fingering. Those open Gs do not really make your life any easier, especially because they're underneath a slur. A lot of times they won't speak right. I actually think it's easier to just play this as a closed G. it sounds better. The one exception is where I just stopped in measure 6, where we have to shift up into third position. Right there, it's probably best to play it open. In measure 14 to 16, keep as much tension out of your left hand as possible. This is all technically third position, but it's a large area to cover, and we have to constantly go back and forth between the G and the D. Any amount of tension there and that won't work. Maybe at first try practicing it with no slurs and then putting the slurs back in. This one is all about the bowing that you find in measure 2. Instead of practicing the preparation the way that it's written, I would recommend just taking one note and practicing that bowing until you're happy with it. And do that until you can get it really crisp and comfortable at the tempo you're going for. Remember to get a loud sound at the tip of the bow, we have to pronate and put extra weight into the string because the bow weighs so much more here than it does here. If we do nothing, the sound will just get soft. So as you get closer to the tip, you have to put more weight into the first finger. And then when you go up into fourth position, maybe do the same exercise on a note up here and figure out what you have to do differently to keep the same crisp sound up here. I would say start with the bow closer to the bridge and then experiment with the weight and the speed. Beethoven Contredanse. This one's a lot of fun to play, and it's a great way to end the book. The arpeggio shape in the beginning is written all in third position. That's one way to do it. If it was super fast, that would probably be the most practical way. However, I think you're going to get a better sound if you started in first position. This is a pretty common way to play arpeggios like this. I would recommend learning it both ways. You'll probably need both at some point. The marking in measure 10 might look a little strange, but all that means is to play your closed G and your open G at the same time. So try to make sure they're in tune. 15 through 18 can be pretty tricky, so I'd recommend slow practice with a metronome first. And in the second to last line, I find the double stops a lot of fun to play. Just make sure that your thumb does not get in the way, because it's supposed to be open G, right? When you're playing. If you put the thumb across, you'll end up with... Still doesn't sound bad, but it's just not the way that it's written. So... Well, congrats, you made it to the end of the book. If you found this useful, please consider leaving a like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, please leave them down below in the comments. Thanks for watching.